Hello and welcome to Wild Sounds Civilized, a monthly podcast about music, literature, and everything in betwixt. Today we're talking about Peter and the Wolf by
Sergei Prokofiev.
Excellent. Some Russian guy, right?
Some Russian guy, yeah. So this is I like to call it a picture book with sound instead of pictures.
Okay.
So it's a narrative that's sort of interjected with different pieces of music that represent the characters in the story and what's happening with them. Originally written in the 1930s.
I just realized we did not introduce ourselves.
We didn't. I'm Bailey Duff.
And I'm Emily Kate.
Okay. And what I really love about this work in particular that we get to talk about is that neither the narrative or the music take precedence over each other. I really like the fact that they're kind of just entirely interwoven. Mm-hmm. Sort of the plot going on is you have Peter, your main character, living with his grandfather in the countryside of Soviet Russia. And he goes out into the field, he runs into his friends, the duck and the bird and the cat, and they all have a little bit of fun ribbing among friends, and he is dragged back to his cottage by his grandfather, who says, "You cannot play out there. There might be a wolf." And that is the foreshadowing for later. So he ends up going back, of course, because he's got all the protagonist problems, I would say, that they usually have. And of course there's a wolf, and he swallows the duck whole, and then he's going for that bird, and the bird is having an absolute panic attack above his head, and Peter makes a noose out of a rope, and he drags the wolf by the tail up the tree, and then hunters come out of absolutely nowhere, and they want to kill the wolf, and Peter convinces them that no, they should go to the zoo, where they can take the wolf for the benefit of all of the people of Soviet Russia. And there is a parade, and the duck is still alive inside of the wolf's tummy. And that's the cliffhanger that it ends on.
All right. The Disney version does something different, though.
The Disney version does. I'm not super familiar with it.
Hidden in the tree.
Yeah, the duck is hidden in the tree. I understand why they did that, but when I taught with this story, that was like the most, spellbinding part for the kids. I taught it to my grade 1 classes in my music classes, and they were enjoying it before. They were into it, but the minute that wolf swallowed that duck, there was like this collective, everybody's eyes got big, and there was a little bit of like, like it just got real. And their eyes are like, you could drop a pin in that room. And I would say it was a little bit maybe on the verge of too scary for them. There was definitely one class where I had to explain, but the duck's okay. Like, they're fine in there. We're going to find out later. But yeah, the stakes were raised, I would say.
Right.
But it's interesting because Prokofiev did the text as well as the music. This was something that I was interested about because I've taught with this many times. And I actually didn't know that he had written the original text as well. So this is I guess Wagner would call it a complete artwork. It's one vision that makes the whole thing. I think he's kind of akin to a director in this sense. Okay. Usually if you had a musical work, you would have, let's say an opera, you would have somebody compose the music, and you would have somebody write the libretto, the script. And those are always different people, right? You think of even musicals. You have Rodgers and Hammerstein, or whatever musical people listen to, because I don't listen to musicals. But there's usually a separation in terms of who does what. But this is complete. And Sergei Prokofiev, I think, was an interesting person to do this, because he was born in Russia at the time to a farm scientist, which I didn't know was a job.
Okay.
I wish somebody talked to me about that in like grade 10 careers class, because farm scientist sounds cool. And his mother was, I believe, a serf. And he went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory and he trained. But the minute there was the revolution in 1918, he got special dispensation to leave the country. Yeah, he
Really?
lived in Germany for a while. He lived in the United States for a while. He lived in Paris. He married a woman from Spain. But the Great Depression hit, and nobody wanted to pay for the type of work that he wanted to do. He wanted to write these large-scale operas, these lavish orchestrations, like any composer, right? Like, you want as many options as you can get. And eventually he ended up going back to the Soviet Union at this point because they were willing to pay for him to write nationalistic music, even if he had dipped as soon as they went super nationalistic.
Right.
So this is right at that sort of honeymoon period in his life where they're trying to woo him back. They're saying, hey, like, write some music for us, Prokofiev. We would love some good old-fashioned children's folk music of Russia to indoctrinate our youth with. And over time, that relationship soured, and he was accused many times of being unnationalistic. Or there's a specific quote that I can't remember. It was accusing him of formalism, which is what they sort of called anything that was subversive without being able to put your finger on it.
Okay.
So formalism was, it could be as simple as using Western conventions in composing instrumental music. It could be as simple as you said something in person to someone, but they want to accuse your actual artwork to erase you from the whole place, the whole world. So this work is especially interesting to me because it doesn't seem overtly Soviet at first.
Right. That was my thought, too, as you're talking about how this was specifically created for children.
Yeah.
To be nationalistic. It didn't strike me as that, listening to it.
No, me neither. And I don't think I would have taught with it if I had thought that. Something I found really interesting is when I looked into this, the first thing I sort of thought was that this is a morality tale about animal rights. Because I am coming from a place of incredible bias. I thought, this is about not killing the wolf even though he attacked your friends. You're taking him somewhere to be humane and safe. That seemed to me to be the moral of the story. And as I looked into it, I found that the moral of the story is that the grandfather is wrong and old-fashioned, and you should do what you want, young person, and be brave. Which is not what I took from the story at all.
No.
But apparently that was the intended message. And of course there's many intended messages. But I think part of it is that there was this old guard that had lived in Russia for decades before there was a Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, the revolution consisted mainly of young people. And so you have basically this generation of grandparents that aren't really on board with everything going on politically. You have this generation of parents that are going along with things that either were part of the revolution or went along with things at the very least. And you have these kids. Who is raising them? A combination of both of those above generations. Right. And so it's a way to destabilize the children's trust in the elder generation so that they're more likely to work with the Soviet Union. And that's, of course, like, very melodramatic for what this actually is. It's like a cute little folktale. But from what I've heard, this was the intended messaging. And maybe this was the way that it was portrayed to the Soviet Union. Maybe this was the purpose as it was explained to the people that had to approve it.
Right. Oh. I was going to say it's like shoveling the shit till you get yourself funded and...
Yeah, I think the funding here is really interesting. It was bought by a sort of children's theater to put on. It was this specific sort of lady who ran it that commissioned the work. But there wasn't artwork in the Soviet Russia at the time that went unapproved. It had to be okayed by somebody. You had to have somebody putting the stamp on it and being like, this is Soviet, that's all good. And I wonder how much of this piece caters to that and how much of it caters to what Prokofiev wanted to do and how much of it caters to children. Because it's a great children's tale. Obviously, it's endured. And he had children at the time. Clearly he understood what they needed to make this narrative work. I feel way more conflicted about this after researching it than I did teaching it for the past couple of years, and I don't know if I will teach it next year.
Well, a lot of children's literature has that nationalistic messaging behind it. Like if you think of Maya the Bee, I think his name is Bonsai or something like that. It's German.
Cool.
We'll put it in the show notes, the actual person's name. Yeah. And then Bambi. They're both nationalist texts.
Yeah.
And again, it's feeding the young generation a very specific message. I think specifically with Maya the Bee, she is a bee that leaves her colony and goes on this adventure out in the world and then gets attacked by a bunch of wasps and has to rely back on the colony. And the message at the end of the day is that you have to keep the colony strong. And you should live in the hive.
Just with a little dash of xenophobia. Just a little sprinkle. Yeah, okay. Yeah, children's literature, children's media, I think is most of the time fairly messed up.
Yes, yeah.
And a lot of that, I think, comes from the fact that you're trying to create something for a child, which always means that you're going back to your own childhood to sort of mine what material you can. And there's also the idea, specifically in Kodai methodology, which is what I was trained in to teach, that children have their own culture. As an adult, you are always an outsider. For lack of a better description, you're like Jane Goodall among the apes. You are just trying to blend in and figure it out, but you're never a part of it. And your job as an educator is to accept their culture and accept that you're a guest in it and try to bring things to them that are of their culture. So, for example, I will teach with Ring Around the Rosie, but I won't teach with Head and Shoulders, Knees and Toes. One was propagated by children over years. Ring Around the Rosie is popular now because it was kept alive by generations of children, whereas Head and Shoulders, Knees and Toes was an older melody that was written for a didactic purpose, for teaching children their parts of their body.
Right.
So, long story short, what children's culture is represented here?
It seems like no children's culture.
Yeah. Kind of. I really wonder about whether this comes across as a fable to you.
It did.
Yeah. But what was your sort of takeaway moral of the story?
Especially with the Disney version, where Peter is in red, you've got the Little Red Riding Hood thing happening, right?
Yeah.
Disney specifically put him in red.
Yeah, there's a lot of messaging in the Disney version.
And red is always... I guess it was interesting for me that, first of all, Peter was a boy and he was in red, because the red in Little Red Riding Hood is a symbol of maturation, menstruation.
Yeah.
And so when you stray from the path, you're straying from purity.
Yep.
And the wolves in the woods are not necessarily four-legged, which a lot of fairy tales explore. The idea of the werewolf or the predator or just a human man hitting on a young girl in the woods.
As happens.
Yeah. And so that Peter leaves the garden. He's strayed from the path. He's disobeyed his elders. He's in the red. He has a gun, so he's clearly mature enough to have a gun.
Gun is a weird one to me because it's not in the original text.
No?
No. The hunters have guns, and to me that is kind of the purpose of the hunters coming into the story. And they're the hammer, right? If the wolf is causing problems and Peter's created a temporary sort of entrapment, the hunters come in to say, let's kill him. Peter didn't have that option on his own.
Right.
The reason it's interesting is because when Peter is given the option, he chooses not to. And that's originally what I thought the moral was about. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not. But the red, the Soviet flag...
Oh, true. Although then it's Disney taking over it, and Disney would probably... Disney's American.
Super anti-communist.
So that's why I felt especially with the Disney version, it's tying it back to Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah, for sure. And I think from what I remember of the Disney version, the way that it's sort of animated does not seem particularly Russian to me. I don't think they were trying to get across any sort of identity with it, not even in the sense of like, ooh, this is exotic and from another land, it's Russian. But it just felt like a European, pan-European folktale that was sort of taken and, I don't want to say westernized, but Disney-fied?
Yeah.
I do think that there's elements of that Sovietness that remain in the Disney version, but it's fairly scrubbed. But if you've seen the Disney version more often, with the duck, it goes into the tree. It doesn't get swallowed. At the end, is the duck mentioned again?
Yes. So the wolf pulls off its tail.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so that's why they think that he's been eaten. And then at the end, the duck comes out. Everybody's sad. And the duck comes out of a hole in the tree. And they're like, oh, there you are. And he has no tail. So then they get the tail and the duck sticks it back on his butt and like wiggles it. And is like, see, I'm all good. Everything's happy. So that's how Disney sort of got around that.
Okay. That's weird.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fun. I'm used to the original version. And there's some part of me that as much as I love changing and moving things around and I don't greatly care what a composer wants, the fact that this is just a rare occasion where the composer wrote the text and the music, I don't want to say it feels sacred, but it feels uncomfortable to sort of edit it. Although the thing to add here is that version was made in Prokofiev's lifetime with his approval. I mean, with his approval plus money.
Right.
But this was a version that he ultimately supported. And I wonder if that's a cultural difference. Maybe children in the Soviet Union were A-okay with duck swallowing just any time, and children in America were maybe more sheltered to the realities of wildlife.
Right. Or does it maybe go back to his purpose? Like if his purpose was to educate children, and he was trying to get this funded and pass it through Soviet approval. Right?
Yeah.
Like, is the Disney one that he did approve of more
accurate? Yeah. I don't know. I think from what I can tell, and this is a Disney digression, but from what I can tell, the Disney company seems to be very particular about how they adapt things. I'm thinking particularly of what happened with Mary Poppins, where they do not greatly care about the source material. They will change things right, left, and center, even if the author, as in Mary Poppins or Peter and the Wolf, is alive to create input, better options, things that they might prefer. They essentially, by the rights, take over and do what they want.
Right.
Which they could at that time. They had all sorts of weird, shady practices. Like, I'm sure you've heard about the voice of Snow White. The lady who voiced her basically signed a contract saying that she couldn't work anywhere else. She had to just be the voice of Snow White because she wanted to be sort of, I mean, they wanted her to be iconic in the public's mind. And those were different times, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting to compare the versions, though neither, I think, are what Prokofiev would have done in a vacuum without the politics. And there is no work that is removed entirely of politics.
No.
But I kind of think to what he did at home with his own kids. The first performance of Peter and the Wolf, he played it on the piano, which totally blew my mind because I think of this as an orchestral work, and not just an orchestral work, but a work that teaches you the instruments of the orchestra.
Right.
That's the whole point, right? You hear each character, it's an instrument. They even, at the beginning, sort of explain it like a cast of characters. Here's the bassoon. It's the grandfather. Although, side note, I want to grow up to be a bassoon. Really badly. Like, at least like an oboe. But if I could be a bassoon when I hit like 65, retire, That's the evolution I'm looking forward to. But they like introduce this cast of characters. You have the bird as the flute, because flutes are always birds. And to think of it on piano, you're not introducing instruments, you're introducing motifs.
Right.
It's just the little melody. It's less didactic on a piano.
For sure.
It's purely a story that you're telling with little musical ideas to children. He must have done that with his own kids. When you think about story time at home with Papa Sergei, I can imagine him at a piano making up stories for his children. And I think that it works sort of blown up to a grand scale on an orchestra as a work that's teaching you how to recognize instruments. But I kind of think it might be more special and more artistic and less of just a tool to use for learning on a piano or on whatever instrument one is comfortable with.
Right.
With a group of children. When I taught this, I did use recordings because my thinking was this is meant to identify orchestral instruments. It was part of our unit. We needed to identify orchestral instruments. And when I think about it now, I wonder if I would have created more meaning for my students to have heard it more as a story and less as a tool, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Would you teach it again?
I feel really weird about it now. And I don't know if that's just because I've been reading about it and thinking about it, and it's been running in the back of my mind for, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month?
Yeah.
Ha ha ha. And I taught it the week before we decided to do it. So it's been Peter and the Wolf all day, every day, just as a background program in my head. I think that if I were to teach it again, I definitely would not want to use a recording. I think recordings have their place, but I see during breaks and lunch how kids just have their eyes glued to the screen and they just zone out. They go somewhere else. And that escapism is great. That escapism has a purpose. But I know that they do it a lot.
Right.
And part of the value of music education isn't just showing them music. It's showing them that they can create music. It's making it seem accessible and real and tangible. And I can't think of a way to do that with a recording that would match A, a live performance, or B, what I can cobble together on what instruments I have in front of them. I think it's way more entertaining for them to see their teacher try to play all these different parts on different instruments than to watch a video of high-quality professionals play it start to finish with a narrator.
Right.
But that is just me, coming from a place of bias, as I always do.
So, I have a question about the text.
Yep.
So there is, standard text.
There is.
Because the text... So you gave me 2 recordings.
Yep.
There was the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra.
I like that one.
And then there was the Disney one. And what I found really interesting and sort of jarring, because I was expecting the same narration twice.
Yeah. The Disney version is so short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it wasn't even like they cut out the dialogue. They completely changed the narration. So
yeah.
When it's performed, do people follow set dialogue?
Yeah, so the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra version is, I would say, pretty much like gold standard. That's what you get across the board. If you're going to a live performance of Peter and the Wolf, you will hear those words by a narrator. You will hear an orchestra play those parts. It will be in that order and approximately that length. So you're looking at about 30 minutes. The Disney version, I think, clocks in at 15.
Yeah.
It's so short. And originally, I wondered if that was an issue of translation. It was written in Russian, which you run into some things translating Russian. And I actually managed to pull an orchestral version with narration that I just sort of read through. And it is pretty close to the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra version. I think there's a couple of things that are sort of, I want to say anglicized. There's some cutesy little phrases that are definitely very British that are thrown in there, but I would say it is the most faithful. I did not listen to a Russian version, and I should have, just to sort of compare it, but I did look at the text. And one of the big reasons I looked at the text is I was really interested in how you cue this, because this is a nightmare. Like, thinking purely from a musician's perspective, you have a piece, you begin it with everybody, you work through everything that you have, but if you're not playing for a segment of time, you have a rest. You can count the beats you're not playing, you can figure all of that out. For Peter and the Wolf, there's a narrator in between sections. And so the conductor is constantly cueing people to come in. If you think about starting as being sort of the most difficult part to get everybody together, that's a problem that you run into pretty quickly. It was how I was interested is how they notate it. Do they put in a rest? Do they have segments that stop and then there's text in the middle of the page? And it's just a very weird multimedia thing to write out for a musician. And largely what they do is they have a rest with a fermata. And a fermata is a symbol that just means pause, just stop, hang out here for a little bit. And then the text will be above in Russian, just so they kind of know what's going on. A lot of the things that are coming in are single instruments, so it's less of a big deal to cue. But the timing of this, and when to come in, and when to stop, I don't want to call it nightmarish, because it is doable and people do it. But I'm thinking specifically, if I were to try to get a student orchestra to do this, that would probably be the most annoying thing to do. But I was really interested in how it was actually written, especially because it feels like this is a piece with no text. There's nothing that we sticky note. There's nothing that we can, oh yes, and then on page 4 this happens. It feels really intangible. And so I was super excited to actually just get a score that I could read through and be like, I see. It made it easier to pin down for me, I think.
Okay.
As a visual learner.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about having the written text and just seeing what sort of notes I would have made on it.
Yeah.
Because I looked at the Russian score as well, and I was like, I don't read Russian, so cool.
I read Russian very badly. So. Yeah. The text is interesting in how it's written. None of this music, I don't want to say condescendingly, but none of it is groundbreaking. There's nothing in here that's new for the time, but it's interesting to see it notated. It's interesting to see the way the script sort of fits in. I wish I could have seen a script as he would have written it for a narrator originally, and if it would have included any musical elements, or if it would just say pause right now for about 15 seconds. Because as a narrator, I can imagine coming in and not knowing when you're speaking and when you're not, which I guess is the other element I should have been thinking of, but I'm just thinking of those poor musicians. And this is something that you would iron out in rehearsal, of course, and it's not as big a deal as I'm making it sound. But I really this is a weird work for this reason.
Right, so now I'm wondering, is the dialogue written out like choir music?
Nope. No.
So it's like they're not speaking within time. He's not keeping time while he narrates.
No.
He's just sort of improvs.
It's just improv. Yeah, you're just saying the words and then the thing comes in. And this is why I do think of it as a picture book with music. It just happens to not have the pictures or the book. Which does, because I am assuming there are not children who read it with the score, make it kind of intangible, that feeling of being unable to pin it down. It's a work in time and in sound, but not necessarily in space, which I think is maybe the difficult access point for some people, wanting to have something that they can hold or figure out visually. Mm-hmm. Which I guess is probably why the Disney version is so popular. It gives you that video element that you can figure out what's going on, even if it's terribly incorrect and involves a duck removing and reattaching its tail.
Yeah, also the adults, like, I think what was so weird for me, like, the biggest thing that stood out was the adults get, like, the hunters, they get so excited about Peter having a gun.
What?
And, like, that it's a Disney thing. And
Okay.
they're like, yay, a kid with a gun.
I know I've seen this, but, like, I feel like maybe I've just blocked it out of my mind because I've done the original, like, so many times. I think I've taught with this because last year and this year, I think we're looking at about under 20 and more than 15 times I've had a class where I've just been like, and we're going to do Peter and the Wolf, and this is how it's going to go. And I do not recall the Disney version. The gun thing is weird. I think the gun thing deserves further exploration by people who maybe are versed in Soviet lore, because it's weird to me that Peter has one in the Disney version, and it's weird to me that the hunters come in at all in the original. I would assume that if you're in a forest with a gun, you see a child somewhere in the distance, you're not gonna, like, come in with guns blazing.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of strikes me as odd. And of course they're orchestrated by the timpani coming in with, like, those crazy shot sounds. Yeah, and are they hunting wolves? They can't be. They've got to be hunting deer, I assume? Something not a wolf? Maybe they're hunting ducks, and that's their motivation here, is to get that duck. But it's weird to me that they come in like a deus ex machina. It's weird that they accept Peter's judgment of the situation. You know what I mean? Like, again, you're a grown-up coming into a situation, dangerous animal, subdued for the moment by a child, could get free. You're like, we gotta get rid of this thing, and the child is like, don't.
Right. So, going back to your generational thing, we then have all three generations of men represented. We have the grandfather, who's like the old, like,
Good
I don't
point.
like what's happening.
Yeah.
We have the hunters, who are adults, who are sort of in the middle, and we have Peter, who's the new wave of thinking. And it's interesting that it's three. Because three is big in fairy tales, right? There's always things that happen in three.
Oh, that's such a good point. Yeah, I mean, the hunters are sort of devoid of personality, though. They're just agents of action. Which I can understand how one would feel that way about one's parents. If you were a child in the Soviet Union, your parents are working all the time and you're being taken care of by your elderly grandparents, which seems to be kind of a common setup. Mm. I wonder, too, that they are all men, but the duck is a lady.
Is the duck a lady?
The duck, I'm pretty certain all of the animals are ladies. I think the duck and the cat and the bird.
I think the Disney one makes a lot of them men.
Ah.
Because I think the bird is wearing, like, a little, like, Russian hat. And it's like his plumage, and he takes his hat off.
Yeah. Good times.
Yeah.
It's weird to me. I think, again, the minute you said Peter being a boy was odd, many things clicked in my head. And yeah, I mean, just narratively, I feel like I would not make more sense of this story, but I would understand something further if Peter was a young lady. Petra, let's say. I think it could have been a story about, similar to Red Riding Hood, where you're going further than the bounds of your home. And even if you're with your friends are also going to be devoured. That's depressing. Yeah, that's overall depressing. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not going to think about that anymore. It's just gone. Although, I can't imagine what the female equivalent of a hunter would be in those times to come in and decide that situation.
No. And also I feel like they definitely wouldn't have listened to her the way they listened to Peter.
No. Yeah, that's a good point. I could see the grandfather being a grandmother, given that he's not listened to.
Yeah.
And he's a bassoon, which... we can all aspire to be one day. But it's interesting that the humans are men and the inhumans are women. Just throwing that out there just for a moment. I mean, the Soviet Union was a great equalizer in terms of legal rights, mainly because they wanted more women workers. But there's definitely some ingrained hinkiness there, in my mind at the very least.
Yeah.
Especially the wolf is eating ladies. Like, right? He's not going after Peter. He could. I think that's implied. But he goes straight for the duck. Then he's going for the bird. And the cat has noped the hell out of there. And Peter is able to sort of slip around and make a noose. And, I don't know, take him out of the equation. The wolf doesn't immediately go for Peter the human. Which, I mean, a human child is probably like a great kill for a wolf.
Yeah.
It's fairly helpless. It doesn't know what it's doing. It's not able to get any help. Yeah, and it's fairly meaty. Like,
just justifying eating children.
Yeah. I mean, if I was a wolf, that would make more sense to me. Go for the human child and not the duck. I can't imagine feathers are very good. I mean, I have not had meat in 13 years. I don't know about any of this. Not an expert. But if I was the wolf, I would go for the better ratio of mass to stupidity.
Fair. That's fair.
Thank you. Thank you for justifying my child murder.
Getting away from child murder.
Yep.
I think it's I don't know which one anymore, but there was somewhere the narrator said imagination is a wonderful thing as like the message of the whole piece, or like the summary of the whole piece.
Yeah.
So is that what this piece is supposed to do?
I don't know anymore. Gone so far down the Soviet rabbit hole. I wondered, like, we're accepting this literally, like, at face value, but if the animals are not talking, what is actually happening? You know, like, what is the life of Pi pulling up the curtain and the zebra was his mom moment here? Is the duck another child? I hope not. That would make more sense from the wolf's perspective. Or are these animals that he's hanging out with and he's imagining them speaking and he identifies with them greatly and he disrupts the natural order of the world, which is wolves eating teeny tiny animals, because he is a human and has given himself the right to do so. Which seems like a fairly Soviet moral of the tale, perhaps. That makes sense to me.
I guess it's interesting the way these pieces live on and are experienced completely out of context.
Yes, totally. I can't imagine being a little kid with no experience with this piece walking into the first performance of it. Was this your first experience with the piece?
Yeah.
What was your, like, immediate takeaway? What was, like, the, oh, okay, like, afterwards?
Let's see. I was taking notes, just sort of train of thought notes.
Yep.
The French horns at some point reminded me of the Harry Potter soundtrack.
Yeah. Oh, I love a good French horn. Yeah, and it's because it's that really close harmony. The Hedwig's theme from Sorcerer's Stone, Philosopher's Stone, whatever. That dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
Dun, that's also in close harmony. And the French horn, the tone of it is just very, like, dark and low and mysterious and exciting. That's my favorite part of the piece, the French horns. Just more French horns. That's what I need. I need more bassoons, and I need more French horns. Scat.
Just cut everyone else out.
I mean, yeah. I mean, no. But, yeah. Yeah.
And then I guess this sort of intertext that maybe listeners bring to it now. Like, obviously, this was written so many years later.
Yeah.
But just what you're reminded of in terms of, like, Harry Potter's another piece of children's literature. It's sort of fantastical. It's part of the magical, otherworldly, which I think fairy tales sort of fall into with the talking animals.
Totally.
So everything about the first experience with this text was, for me, a real rooting in children's literature and fairy tales.
Okay.
to be honest, despite the fact that it had a very Russian name, I don't think I would have looked at it as a political piece, just having listened through it.
And I didn't either until doing this podcast. Yay. So you're saying you sort of viewed it as a children's piece of literature. I'm trying to remember back to first hearing this, and I think I was a preteen, actually. And to me, it felt very adult.
Really?
Because it's a symphonic work. Because you're hearing a full orchestra, because it was classical music. At that point, I only had experience with classical piano. I had not played an orchestral instrument, and my family was not super orchestra versed, I would say. And getting into more orchestral classical music, this was the gateway drug, as it were, of seeing what everybody could do. Coming from a piano, you have this very limited tone. I mean, there's controversy, but you really don't have much control over tone, even if you do have control over the individual sort of timbre of a note. And to hear what could be done with those French horns, for example, they sound so sinister. Mm-hmm. They sound so evil, but kind of, I don't want to say sexual, but like,
it's a sexy French horn.
It's a sexy French horn. Yeah, that's a very sexy French horn part. It's just the texture of it was really like, I don't want to say overwhelming. I do want to say overwhelming. It was just like this whole other planet compared to piano. I did have that experience with a bunch of other orchestral works at the same time, though. It wasn't exclusive to Peter and the Wolf, but it did seem more grown up to me because of that context, which I suppose it doesn't, looking back in retrospect, to the children that are experiencing it now. And I think that I keep going back to, it's a picture book with sound, was really the key to unlocking it for my students. Because otherwise, it's sound being made at them for a while. But what we had to kind of emphasize was close your eyes and imagine when you're hearing the music, which I don't think would have been instinctual if I hadn't had to outline it beforehand for them. But that is the stepping stone to a full orchestral work with no text, with no narrator, with maybe one of those lovely names like Minuet in G major that gives you just nothing to deal with. And they can listen to an instrumental work and know, okay, well, the protocol here is I kind of close my eyes and imagine, so that's what I'm going to do. It's that setting up their ability to listen to instrumental music with text and story, I think so. I hope so.
Yeah.
I really hope that I haven't accidentally raised a little generation of communists.
I mean,
communism. I mean, I do.
I mean, it's not bad.
And yet I don't.
Theory.
I hope that the takeaway is what I thought the takeaway was, which to me is those orchestral sounds, the folktale element, and just the fantastical nature. Mm-hmm. It could have been more fantastical. I'd be fine with that. I hope that they saw it as an opportunity to see that instrumental music could be for them, and an opportunity to connect stories, especially stories that maybe they know better and are more comfortable with, to what seems to be a kind of inaccessible art form to them, at least for now. Although I know plenty of adults that you run into and they're like, oh, classical music, I would love to get into that, but I just don't know anything and I won't look into it and I just don't know. Like, it seems silly to be like, this is how you listen to something. But I think by analyzing how we do it with children, it makes it much easier to access it with adults that haven't had the same degree of experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm sad for them, but they should go listen to Peter and the Wolf.
Yeah.
And comparative works, I would say Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to Orchestra is similar in that it's sort of introducing the elements of orchestra. Tubby the Tuba, also a Disney version of that. I think Fred Astaire voices Tubby. It's about like a tuba that runs away from the orchestra because he doesn't just want to go womp womp all the time. No, he doesn't want to go pa pa. That's what he doesn't want to do. And he like, it's great. I think I saw the whole thing on YouTube. It's weird. I mean, his voice sounds like a middle-aged man in the 70s. He's like, I don't want to go oompa, oompa. And you're like, go be a car salesman then. It's a real time. But I think relating more to sort of picture book with sound, more modern works, there's The Musical Life of Gustav Moll, which I teach with as well. And there is The Composer is Dead by Lemony Snicket, which I highly, highly recommend, which again introduces the instruments of the orchestra, but in the context of a murder mystery. And it comes with a CD, and it's super fun. But as far as similar works in terms of just being sound and narrative, I think that's it. I think you got to graduate to opera after that.
Well, didn't Disney do a number of these where they took classical music, like the Fantasia?
Yes. Well, I think this was originally supposed to be part of Fantasia, and that may be a reason for the time being what it was. They did sort of take these classical works and give them a visual narrative to go along. And I think the attempt was to make accessible works accessible, but they were already kind of accessible.
Right.
And I wonder, like, I dig Fantasia. Nobody's saying that I don't dig Fantasia. But to me, the experience of watching something like that is not the experience of listening to that piece of music. Listening to that piece of music, your imagination runs wild, you think about things, and not just like, oh, I'm making up a story in my mind, but I'm thinking about the texture of that. You're going into sort of abstract forms of thought that you can't access when you're thinking, oh no, what's Mickey gonna do with all these brooms?
Right.
It's almost like a movie adaptation of a book. You get used to the character in your mind. It's exactly the way you think it is. You go back to your old friend and you read it and you're like, oh yes, as I remembered. And then you watch a film version and it's not how you remembered it. And it's making you think about that a whole lot. And it's doing all of the work for you in terms of thought. And then going back to your original work every time you're thinking, oh, wait, is that how I remember it from the movie? Or is that how I remember it from my imagination?
Right.
Yeah, although whenever that like bum 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 gets in my head, I'm like, oh, brooms. And I don't know if that's what I would have thought if I hadn't seen Fantasia.
Oh my gosh. Oh dear. Did we hit all the things?
We hit all the things.
We hit all the things.
I think we did it. And
all
I think
right.
we did it in a reasonable amount of time. I would give it a solid 7 out of 10.
Okay.
Which we will discuss. Maybe a 7.5. 7.5 out of 10.
The piece? Or, like, the experience of the podcast?
Both.
Okay.
I think they're both a solid 7.5 out of 10. I feel that's just how I am today.
Okay.
I'm feeling positive in general. And a little bit discerning. That's my mood.
Fair.
Current mood. Thanks for listening. Wild Sound Civilized is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Attawandarong peoples. Transcripts are available on our website.
Our intro music is Fantasia in D minor by Georg Philipp Telemann, performed by Bigley Duff. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Wild Sound Civilized with a Z. You can email us at wildsoundcivilizedpodcast@gmail.com. And if you liked what you heard here today, you can support us on patreon.com/wildsoundcivilized.